Welcome to the Youth Enviro Show.
Yep, your favorite Enviro show.
Educative but yet fun.
And humble, down to earth.
So I'm Esther.
And I'm Sharissa.
It is good to have you here on our show.
Yep, so stay tuned because we'll catch you right after this break.
Hi, I'm Priscilla and you're watching the Youth Enviro Show.
Welcome back. If you have been following our previous shows, we have been speaking about climate change
And migration.
Climate change and human rights.
And even though we don't know what climate change will be like in the future, at least we have enough information to act on it.
That's correct, because even though we know about these effects, we still need to identify the solutions, the adaptations, the resilience.
Yes.
And that's brought us to today's topic: climate change, adaptation, and resilience.
Yes, and you know that actually countries already in the world have come together finding ways, solutional ways for their communities to adapt and be resilient because of the effects of climate change has had on them.
Remember, we cannot change or reverse climate change. However, we can find solutions and adaptations to be able to curb climate change.
Yes, and mentioning on that, as I've said, countries, do you know that in 2020, the United Nations actually created a body that's called the Adaptation Committee of countries all over the world, where they come together finding reasonable solutions for each and every country on how they can adapt and be resilient within their countries. And to mention that Netherlands has actually started the Delta program. Now, if you know, Delta is when a river spreads out into 5 ways. And the Netherlands is actually very susceptible to heavy rainfall, causing it to flood. And so they've created this delta that allows all the flood water to gather into one space, almost like a dam. So then that way they have water that they can keep on using for a longer period of time.
So which means that they have changed the way of how water is being channeled.
Yes, exactly.
Talking about Philippines, for example, it is actually one of the countries that has been really affected by climate change when it comes to typhoons, when it comes to drought, when it comes to temperature rises,
Earthquakes.
exactly, floodings and drought. Actually, a lot is happening there in the Philippines. However, the government was actually introduced to developmental goals that will help to adapt to climate change. They needed to come up with projects that could help that specific country, which is the Philippines, to come up with now adaptation plans and forms of resilience.
Yes, but before we give you more examples of what countries have done, let us talk about what adaptation and resilience actually means and entails.
Climate adaptation essentially means any measure that protects a community or ecosystem from the effect of climate change, while also building long-term resilience to avoid environmental conditions. Remember, adaptation is open-ended and takes many forms. In Africa, countries such as Senegal, there is actually a village called Podor, whereby capacity building was actually introduced. The women were actually trained on how to raise nurseries, on how to plant seeds. They have turned a drought desert village into an agroforestry place. This means that they were actually introduced to nurseries, they were planting many trees, and it actually turned out to be a success because as these trees were growing, the ecosystem was restored, as well as plenty of biodiversity was actually coming forth because the whole area was just green.
Wow, you know, this is definitely an innovative way and a new way of farming that we have to look at. And that is what climate adaptation is, looking at new ways of farming and better technologies that we can predict the weather to help the people that are affected by cyclones, typhoons, and also finding sustainable ways on how you can store water that we already have.
Yes, just to add to that, in Senegal again,
Uh-huh.
they were not only introduced to nurseries, which are just random plants, they were actually introduced to more like to grow vegetables that could actually survive the
In that-
harsh condition.
Wow.
And it was really a success.
Well, if we think about our own country as well, we know that Namibia is pushing it's pushing its best for adaptation ways, ne?
It's really pushing and it's moving forward. For example, in Kunene region, there is a project coordinated by UNDP and Daniela Leg. This project actually introduced or donated 10 goats to each woman that was actually selected in that project. These 10 goats were not just ordinary goats, they were actually drought resistant goats. And in the process, these women were trained how to take care of these goats. And in the return, they actually benefited a lot. They benefited organic manure that they could use to start up gardens.
Or fertilizers.
Fertilizers, that's correct.
Nice.
They also benefited the goat's milk and they could actually feed their children. They benefited the goat's meat as well.
Yeah.
So it was actually a success, and this is actually done to curb or
To help them adapt.
that's correct.
Yeah, to, you know, the weather changes or what is happening, droughts that our country is facing.
Yeah, because if these goats actually multiplies, they will actually benefit this whole village in the long run, because the whole village now will be full of drought resistant goats, and in other part of the countries as
Exactly.
well, they will adapt to that and they will take it for themselves.
Yeah, because we all know goat meat is lekker meat, ne? You know, that skapkop, you know, you burn it nice. But then, you know what DBN has been doing in Namibia? Funding a lot of projects for renewable energies, such as the ones that we mentioned in our previous episode, ne?
First one.
The first one, yes, that has been helped by NAM Power as well, where they're looking at renewable, you know, energy with the wind panels that are close to Luderitz.
So, in case you're wondering what is DBN, is Development Bank of Namibia.
Yeah, guys, sorry if I didn't mention that.
Yeah, and then not only that, the whole country is busy, and we are talking about renewable energy, which is actually the green hydrogen.
Yes.
And this is actually what we are looking forward to, because we are thinking that it will be very good for us as it's going to help us to adapt to climate change.
Exactly. And the Green Hydrogen Conference was last week. So make sure that you are reading up about what our country is busy planning on implementing to make sure that we are adapting and that we are resilient to the changes, because as we mentioned also in our previous episodes, what has been happening, we face severe drought every second year, and then the flooding that happens when we receive unexpected rainfalls. And that's why it is very important for our country and our communities, us, to help our country sustain and adapt to, you know, the ever-changing weather patterns.
Just to add on that, the government and local authorities are really trying hard. They are distributing seeds which are drought resistant.
Wow.
And this is actually helping us to adapt to climate change.
Because we have to look at new ways of farming and, you know, measures that we could introduce, but, you know, it's still a talk in progress, is either looking at farming pigs, because as we all know, pigs eat a lot of, you know, everything that is around them.
Whenever it's available,
What
most of the time.
Yeah, and then we could look at a new product that Namibia could be exporting as well. We could have bacon and pork. Instead of importing it, we could now become the ones that produce it and export it. Hello and welcome back, guys. What would an episode be without an interview from an expert to lend their advice or, their intelligence to share it with us? And today we are joined by this beautiful woman. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for having me on your show here today. My name is Priscilla Mundilo. I am an agri-environmental engineer by profession, but I work in development cooperation, primarily in natural resource management projects with a focus on climate change.
Well, what a beautiful introduction. But now let's jump into some questions that we have for you today. Priscilla, would you please briefly explain to us what is climate change adaptation and resilience?
Yes, a very good way to start this discussion is to, of course, outline some of these key terms that we'll be using as we go along in our discussion. So, firstly, climate change adaptation is really the measures and the actions that we as individuals, as a community, as a nation take to reduce the negative impacts of climate change. While on the other hand, climate resilience really means our ability or our capacity to cope in terms of the negative impacts of climate change when we are sort of faced with a catastrophic climatic event. So that's really the distinguishing factor between the two terms.
Okay.
Yes.
Which adaptation and resilience measures has Namibia started taking or has put in place?
Yeah, that's a very important question because, as we know, Namibia is the driest country south of the Sub-Sahara, and our economy is heavily dependent on natural resources, especially in terms of our marine resources, our agriculture, as well as nature-based tourism. But at the same time, our natural resources are faced with a lot of challenges, and this, of course, increases the vulnerability of our adaptive capacity. Some of the challenges that we are faced with is population growth. We have a high rural to urban migration, and then we also have poverty, which has prominently manifested itself, especially in the rural areas. And in terms of also our adaptive capacity, we are really faced with lack of skills and technological transfers within the country. But at the same time, the country has been doing quite a lot in terms of climate change adaptation. We are currently developing our national adaptation plan. And this plan really outlines our long to medium term actions in terms of adaptation that we as a country are planning to take, and as well linking it to some financing windows because as we know, adaptation can be quite costly. But at the same time, in terms of practical measures, we all know that Namibia is a party to the Paris Agreement, and we have sort of submitted our intended nationally determined contributions to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as well as to adapt to climate change. And some of the measures that we have outlined here that we've already started working on really is our early warning systems for commercial as well as for communal farmers, developing rainwater harvesting mechanisms or techniques, especially in flood-prone areas. We are looking into recycling and reusing especially grey water, promoting climate-smart agriculture. And really also in the infrastructure side, we are looking into building climate resilient infrastructure, especially in your flood prone areas. As you've mentioned earlier on, if you are faced with a flood, is your house actually resilient to withstand some of these, the floods? So I think those are some of the measures that we've been looking into. And in terms of legislation, we are also looking at enacting a legislation that prohibits, private people or anyone to really build in climate sensitive areas, especially along the coastal areas where we see an increase in the sea level rise. So I think those are some of the measures that we have as a country been looking into in terms of adaptation.
So what are the possible mitigation measures in Namibia to reduce climate change?
No, that's a very important question, and I think it's also important for us to define what mitigation actually means. Mitigation adaptation is really our efforts that we take as individuals, as community, as the country take to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. As I've mentioned earlier, we are party to the Paris Agreement. We have submitted our nationally determined contributions, and we sort of set a target for ourselves to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030. Now, in terms of some of the measures that we as a country has been looking into under this main policy document, is to set up concentrated solar farms or concentrated solar power plants to really implore us to move from burning fossil fuels into using renewable energies. We are also looking at converting our heavy and light vehicles from burning fossil fuels into using nitrogen, and this is also the concept of green hydrogen. We are looking at plans to come up with a mass transportation system within the country to reduce, individual car usage. Yes, exactly. And then we're also looking at other areas where we could have carbon sinks, such as the forestry sector, where we are looking at afforestation as well as reforestation. For our younger users, I think it's important for us to also distinguish between what reforestation and afforestation means. Reforestation is us introducing forests where there used to be forests, but the forests have been cleared out due to people settling in these areas. But at the same time, we're also looking at afforestation, where we are looking at putting up forests at places where there were never any forests. Okay, so those are some of the areas that we've been looking into in terms of the forestry area, in terms of the green hydrogen and energy sector, but also in terms of waste. We have also committed to at least reduce 50% of our waste to energy and compost, especially at our landfills. We are running out of space to actually
not necessarily house, but like to dump.
Yes, so we're running out of space to dump our waste, so it's really becoming a challenge for us. Waste is a problem for us in the country, so those are some of the measures that we've been looking into in terms of mitigation. Thank you.
There you've heard it from her, but what do you think? Do you think Namibia is progressing in combating climate change?
Yes, indeed. I do think Namibia has progressed very well in terms of combating climate change. And I think we've started, a long time ago. For instance, in 2001, we have already established a National Climate Change Committee.
Wow, 2001.
Yes.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time, yeah. So we've already established our Climate Change Committee by then. This committee is basically responsible to advise government on climate change issues. In 2011, we have promulgated our national climate change policy. In 2013, we have also developed our national climate change action plan and strategy from 2013 to 2020. And then in between there, of course, we've also, became signatory to the Paris Agreement, where we have sort of, as a country, shown our commitment in combating the negative impacts of climate change. And at the same time, we are also in progress of developing our nationally determined contribution implementation strategy. This is, of course, going to be used as a tool for coordinating and mobilizing resources from now up until the year 2030. Yes, so, and I think it's also important to mention that, all of these policies that I'm mentioning here are guided by our national development goals. For instance, our national development plans, our Vision 2030, as well as our Harambee Prosperity Plan. So this legislation is really not in isolation, but they really form part of our national plans. But at the same time, I think in terms of what we can still do as a country, of course, with anything comes challenges, So I think in terms of, combating climate change, it's important that we as a country still develop our skills and our capacities and ensure that, our technologies are improved to ensure that we are able to combat climate change much more effectively and efficiently.
Yes. That has brought us to the end of this wonderful interview. Don't forget to like and share these episodes so that we can spread the awareness throughout our Namibian communities. Well, Priscilla, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. It was a pleasure being here today.
Oh, the pleasure is ours. So we'll catch you next week. Bye.
Bye.
I hope you are learning a lot from us, because we are also learning a lot as we are speaking here. We are not just dishing out information so that you can pile up there. We would like you also to go out there and think of other adaptive ways to be able to help the whole country to sustain or to adapt to climate change. So we'll be right back.
Yo, what's up? It's your boy David, and the message for today is that keep your environment clean and don't forget to plant a tree once or twice a year.
My name is Paul.
My name is Cleopas Ase.
Okay guys, there in Rundu, let's keep our environment clean. Please guys.
Did you enjoy that short break? Well, welcome back again. We are talking about measures and how our country is adapting to the effects of climate change,
as well as building long-term resilience. Looking at SASCA is actually one of the organizations, or let me say a research center, that is actually working so hard on doing research. They are doing research on the adaptation measures, like as I have said earlier, the adaptation measures of China or Philippines cannot be the same as ours. Adaptation measures have actually to be different from places to another, as well as from time to time.
And what about human-wildlife conflict, Esther?
Oh yes, human-wildlife conflict. As we all know, climate change has really caused a lot of impact. Talk about drought. When it's too much, wild animals actually are forced to migrate from their place to like the place of origin, closer
to where they can find a livelihood.
Yes, and where they can find livelihood, sometimes it's in our crops. Yeah, so talking about human wildlife, we would like you to comment right down below which adaptation measures are currently in place when it comes to human-wildlife conflict.
Yes, with the help from our government and private sectors.
Exactly.
Well, we have come unfortunately to the end of today's show, but make sure you're getting yourself ready for more next week.
As from me, Esther,
and me, Sharissa,
that seems
bye.